that's great. But, the problem is we're all going to suffer from this. This is going to cause things to go up. And, this is going to last a while. But, when you have a president that's constantly saying, go union, this is what you get. The unions get emboldened, and then they start asking for things that, that companies have a tough time doing. And so I don't think government should get involved in this. These are private sector matters. But I do think the tone of how a president talks about unions and how a president emboldens them does play a role in this. And we're seeing what Biden has done play a role in this.
Do you and would you draw a line, Ambassador, if you were president of the United States, for union jobs versus any jobs? This president clearly does prioritize union jobs. And he's made very clear here that union workers deserve more, that their pay increases have not come close to the success and the money that all of these auto companies have enjoyed. What do you say to that?
Well, I'll tell you, in South Carolina as governor, we were building planes with Boeing. We were building more BMWs than any place in the world. I recruited Mercedes-Benz. I recruited Volvo. We had 5 international tire companies. But I was a union buster. I didn't want to bring in companies that were unionized simply because I didn't want to have that change the environment in our state.
Welcome, everybody. Left Reckoning 136. That was former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley embodying that new Republican pro-worker spirit, union buster in chief. My name is David Griscom. I'm broadcasting to y'all from Austin, Texas, and I'm joined, as always, by my good friend and comrade, Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing very well. I am appreciative of Nikki Haley, also a former Boeing board member, for keeping it on the issues. And I appreciate any chance for these freaks who are going to run the world next to talk about this and to go on the record about this, try to be as clear as possible about who do they support, the workers, and can they say the word union, or the bosses. So I appreciate Nikki there.
Plus some ridiculous free press for Joe Biden, who is getting outflanked by Donald Trump right now on this. We're going to be talking about that a little bit later in the show. And we got a fun one for y'all. In a little bit, we're going to be joined by Matt McManus to talk about his new book on the right wing, philosophical tradition and their fight against equality. Really great conversation. There's a link below for people to check out Matt's work and his book. And then, as I said, later we're going to be talking a little bit more about the UAW, which incredible weekend, just going to say on the top. Some of those early stories we're seeing from the picket line are incredibly inspiring. The success of some of these tactics is great. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what goes on. I know that there's, big potential for this to continue ramping up at the end of this week. But we'll get more in depth into that in just a little bit, because we got to get to this story first. We've been covering it on the program for a little while, and it's Ken Paxton's impeachment trial. Over the weekend, Ken Paxton, who had around 20 charges filed against him by the House, the Senate only heard 16 of them, and over the weekend, Ken Paxton was acquitted on all 16 counts that were brought before the Senate. Remember, for people who weren't paying attention, most of these charges were about his relationship with real estate investor Nate Paul, somebody who himself is in a lot of trouble with the FBI, as is Ken Paxton, who, even though he's acquitted from these things from his impeachment, also does have this federal trial, criminal trial for securities fraud, which should have its first hearings coming up in October. But after weeks of trial, the Senate voted to acquit Paxton on 16 charges. And only 2 Republicans broke ranks with the rest of the GOP and voted to indict Paxton on some of these charges. And, we're just going to go over really briefly what happened. Sort of simple. You don't really have to follow these things too closely. You get it. It's politics. It's politics, right? You can get really in the weeds and talk about legal strategy and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, the senators in the Republican Party decided it's not worth their time to touch this and the threat that it might mean to their seats. Now, there were issues with the prosecution. It certainly didn't seem like the prosecutors were delivering, and the House members who were leading some of these prosecutions certainly were really unorganized at times. And there was a lot of focus, and this is something I talked about on this program and on Griscom streams as this was going on. There was a lot of focus on Ken Paxton's affair and the potential benefits from Nate Paul. Remember, Matt and I were talking about it. Busby, who is one of the lawyers defending Paxton, made a big deal about how these people were talking about how Paxton got all this money to renovate his kitchen, but actually his kitchen's really ugly. Um, you know, they wanted to make it about that kind of thing instead of what it should have been about, in my opinion, which is understand this is a political trial, understanding that you need to make a political argument, not just to those senators who are already getting calls and pressure from all these different folks, but to the general public about what these crimes really were about. Fundamentally, what these crimes really were about was somebody named Ken Paxton, who has been elected to be the Attorney General of the state of Texas, who has responsibilities to the people of Texas to pursue our interests. That means defending public institutions. That means going after corporate and bad actors in the state of Texas who are harming people. And Ken Paxton wasn't doing that. And why was he not doing that? He wasn't doing that because he was trying to help out his buddy Nate, and he was running around having an affair. You make the point here that, you want to focus on the infidelity and all that kind of stuff, maybe to start making your point, fine. But the fundamental crime here is the political crime here is that somebody was elected to do a job and they refused to do it to benefit wealthy people and benefit themselves. That's it.
So you're saying they did a sort of, if the granite countertop is shit, you must acquit.
Yeah, that was basically what the trial was. And again, I don't know if that even would have mattered at this point, because this case was just so clearly political. The question that these GOP senators were asking themselves was, this going to help me or hurt me? And that's why there was a lot of money spent by outside groups to start to put pressure on these senators. In fact, some of these outside groups were paying TikTok people and young people on Twitter to tweet out like pro Paxton. If you came across this trial at all on social media, you were probably getting fed because of the new Twitter algorithm some of these right-wing things about how unfair it is that, the wonderful Ken Paxton is being attacked by a bunch of Democrats, right? They spent a lot of money.
We got to figure out how to get our people that money.
Yeah, that would be good.
I think, I'd be curious how that works.
But of course it's political. And also talking about the trial, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick absolutely interfered with the trial. In fact, he got $3 million from pro Paxton groups before the trial even started. And he made incredibly, just clearly biased decisions in Paxton's favor and against the prosecution. Most importantly, not having Ken Paxton be compelled to testify in his own impeachment, not having the mistress, one of the people who's at the center of this trial, be compelled to testify, and not having Nate Paul, again, one of the major figures in this, being compelled to testify. So now you have all the major witnesses not present. It was hard to, have a trial, and Patrick came up with this bizarre legal argument, No, he was making a decision to make sure that Ken Paxton was safe, to make sure that there wasn't going to be any embarrassing footage for Ken Paxton, either of Ken Paxton or his mistress, or from Nate Paul. But what this really represents, and I think one thing that sort of has been undersaid about this trial, because people are upset, a lot of people sort of figured it wouldn't go anywhere. But the fact that it was so overwhelmingly a vote to acquit, right? That's only 2 Republicans broke. There was a message that was made loud and clear to Texans and to Texans who might work for government or even major organizations within the state. Which is that if you are a whistleblower, you better keep your mouth shut. Because remember, one of the major catalysts of this entire investigation coming from the House was the fact that 4 whistleblowers from Ken Paxton's Attorney General's office, people who are lifelong conservatives, right? Not squishy liberals, not people on the fence, people who believe in the conservative principles of government, right? Who want to do harm to people, do all these kind of things, thought that Ken Paxton was failing in his jobs and blew the whistle. And the message that is coming out from the GOP senators is an attack on whistleblowers in Texas. We do not care about what crimes you see, what attacks happen to the people of Texas and our tax money. If you blow the whistle, the state, the Texas Senate and the Texas executive branch too, frankly, got the backs of the big guys, not you. That's chilling. That's extremely chilling when you're remembering all the other things that are happening in this state right now. There was a war on whistleblowers in the state of Texas and nationally, obviously, as Joe Biden and so many people are willing to try to torture Julian Assange for exposing American war crimes. Now, we got to look at some stuff and talk about a little bit of the fallout because there's going to be consequences for this, both in the sense of, Ken Paxton staying in office, what this represents for the state of Texas, what this means politically. Let's start here with the Mr. Donald Trump, who, if you weren't following the trial, if you weren't keeping up with this kind of thing, remember that most of the trial was sort of trying to cozy Ken Paxton up to Donald Trump. This is another witch hunt coming up against a good MAGA conservative for fighting against the deep state or whatever. They people like Steve Bannon and people like Charlie Kirk, all these folks were trying to paint this narrative, and Donald Trump participated very much. And there's so many great truth posts from Donald Trump. We just had to pick one because I always love how he puts himself at the center of things, even when he's very, loosely involved with it.
Oh, wow, this is funny.
Yeah. Donald Trump says, yes, it is true that my intervention through Truth Social saved Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton from going down at the hands of Democrats and some Republicans, headed by Paul Ryan, Karl Rove, and others, almost all of whom came back to reason when confronted with the facts. Ken has been a great attorney general, and now he can go back to work for the wonderful people of Texas. It was my honor to have helped correct this injustice.
We must point out that the only thing capitalized and, the Trump style guide on what gets capitalized is always sort of a fascinating thing to try to guess at. But the one thing capitalized in there was Truth Social. So he's really
Paul
like,
Rhino.
Right, Paul Rhino, that's right. Which is like, people don't remember Paul Ryan. I don't think.
I know. I love that Trump has like these like old school beefs he's still trying to write people up about. But it's certainly true. I mean, Trump's support of Paxton helped him out tremendously here. And these figures, Trump has also called for Dade Phelan, who's the Speaker of the House, to resign. There's been a big push. If people remember, we played some of this ridiculous documentary that was put out by some of these far right groups in the state of Texas, saying that the Texas House, which, by the way, I don't think I need to tell anybody this, but if you're not paying attention, you don't know, is run by the Republican Party. Some of the most conservative people in the country, people who are regularly praised by conservative organizations in this country for just how far right and conservative they are. This kind of false narrative that the Texas Ledge and the Texas House in particular is run by the Democratic Party, starting with Dade Phelan, again, who is an extreme Republican. These are the people who, as I talk about on the show, all of these things we talked about that came out of the legislature this year, incredibly dangerous and anti-human, anti-working class bills, all go through the House. Right? Remember, they're trying to erode democracy for cities and localities in this state to be able to do minimal things for working people, like mandate water breaks for people in the state that regularly has temperatures over 100 degrees, right? Those are the people that Trump and all these folks are saying are now rhinos and liberals and all this kind of stuff. It's just insane. But what does this like really represent? Like, anyways, we could go through like the titillating stuff, but like, let's be smart for a second, understand what's happening. What's happening right now in politics in the state of Texas is there's a war between the House and the Senate. Remember, if you're paying attention to the Texas legislature, the fight over property tax cuts in the state almost blew up the entire government because the Senate wanted one version of the bill and the House wanted another. Right? They both wanted to make sure that rich people were getting taken care of. They both wanted to use the incredible windfall that the state of Texas had, not to help out everyday people, but to protect property owners. There was just a fight about what class of property owners, what class of rich people got most of the benefit. There is a fight and a war that has been happening between the House and the Senate. It's not about conservatives versus liberals or moderates versus far right wingers. It's different sections of the capitalist class in Texas wanting to be heard first, wanting to get benefits. And these two groups have different people behind them. Andrew Murr and Dade Phelan have been very clear that they back their position. They haven't backed down after the acquittal. And now it's going to be about money. There's going to be well-funded conservative groups that are going to attack people like Phelan, attack people like Murr, attack members of the House, and people who voted to indict Paxton. A civil war is coming, and it's coming. It's already here in the Texas GOP. I don't know how deep it is and what that is going to mean for the primaries that will be coming up for House members. Remember, most people aren't paying attention to this at all. I'm sure, like nationally, people maybe saw it when it came up. Some people in the state of Texas, but this was not a dinner table conversation for most people. It might be a hard sell to say to somebody in Dade Phelan's district, right? He's the Speaker of the House. He can get a lot of things done for you that, you want some other kind of MAGA guy instead of him. I don't know how successful it's going to be, but there's certainly going to be well-funded primary challenges against members of this House. Paxton certainly has come out and condemned this. He's going to be on Tucker Carlson tomorrow, complaining about it. Dan Patrick, the little governor, who again put his thumb on the scale in favor of Paxton when he was supposed to be presiding over the trial, came out with the fiery speech after Paxton was acquitted, named some members of the House that he's probably going to try to tap for a leadership election against Dade Phelan. And notably, Patrick has ordered the state to investigate and do a full audit of the money that was spent by the House in its investigation of Ken Paxton. Right? Very little to say and very little worry for the literal millions of dollars that Ken Paxton has been wasting, both in just helping out Nate Paul and also having to pay off people for his constant legal dramas and exposure that he has. That's not a big worry to the state of Texas. They're going to try to get ammo to come at them later. And again, Paxton is going to have his criminal case coming up. There will be a hearing in Houston in October on that. We'll get a sense of schedule. That's probably going to be something that's going to take a little while. But I wanted to play this clip here because it's notable. This is Busby, who is one of the main lawyers defending Ken Paxton. And this is how he framed this fight in his closing arguments.
Let it be known, let it be clear now. The Bush era in Texas ends today. We thought it had ended in the primary when Ken Paxton beat George P. Bush 68-32. Well, we thought it was over. It wasn't. Well, now we have an impeachment. It ends today. They can go back to Maine. This is Texas.
Man.
By the way, for people who are curious, Busby, I think, certainly has political aspirations after this and is very likely to be running for the Houston City Council. So our friends in Houston, keep your eye out for Busby's run here. I don't know how well it will do there. I mean, the Bush family, as much as Trump has, attacked them, and as much as the GOP, in my opinion, is Trump's party at this point, there is no Texas GOP without the Bush family, right? They fundamentally changed politics in the state with the help of people like Karl Rove. People forget that Texas was a strong Democratic state for the vast majority of its history in the 20th century. And it was the Bush family and its allies who worked so hard to create this current dystopia that we have. So it's always interesting to see these kind of shifting alliances. And there's still a lot of people who are still very loyal to that family. But this is how things are being set up right now. Very clear break happening within the Texas GOP.
That could be the actual death of the Bush family on that, right? Yeah.
I mean, I think politically they're toxic, at least in primary elections in the state of Texas. And it's very clear that
for what on the right, like why are they upset?
Because they didn't support Donald Trump, and everyone has to rally around Donald Trump. No, I mean, really, everyone has to rally around Donald Trump. And what name do you associate with a Republican challenger to Donald Trump? It's the Bush family, Jeb. Right. And then, of course, W not supporting him in the presidential elections and all of that. I mean, Trump has made a big deal about this. And people are saying that, we're not going to be loyal to, the people who opened up all these opportunities for the Republican Party in the state of Texas. We're going to be loyal to Donald. It's going to be interesting because, as I noted, there's this war between the House and Senate that has been ongoing. This was before the Paxton trial started. We talk about this all the time during the legislative cycle in the state of Texas, that there's a war between the House and the Senate. What is going to be really interesting is our governor, Greg Abbott, is now pushing for a special session on school vouchers, a war on public education, and a boon to vultures and people who want access to your money. And they're going to need that to go through the House. Now, if people don't know this about Texas, School vouchers have always been incredibly contentious within the Republican Party here because most people understand what it is. It's pulling money out of public education, public high schools, middle schools, which not only provide like a big level of sociability. Friday Night Lights. It sometimes sounds funny, but these are important things, especially for people in rural Texas. But more
Civic center.
importantly than that, these provide tremendous amounts of jobs and employment for people in rural Texas where they don't have a lot of other opportunities, right? There's a job you can get at your school district. The worry is that most people in rural Texas will not have access to these nice charter schools or things like that, that the rich in San Antonio and in Houston will be able to attend if the school voucher is able to pass. So you add into that mix this already contentious bill and topic with the fact that now Dade Phelan doesn't want to talk to Dan Patrick. The Senate hates the House, and the House feels very betrayed by the Senate. We'll have to see, how successful Greg Abbott's going to be with this push. Fingers crossed, this kind of drama protects public education at least for another cycle in the state of Texas. Greg Abbott says he will take it to special session. He will call another one if it fails. And then he said that, there's the easy way and the hard way. The easy way is for them to all acquiesce to his demands to privatize and brutalize our education system in the state of Texas. The hard way is that he will support primary candidates against holdouts. So there's going to be a big civil war in the Republican Party in Texas. It's going to be very entertaining and interesting to watch. The tragedy is that while they are, in disarray like this, there is no real political alternative coming from the Democratic Party still. And that's the last thing I want to get to before we jump over to Matt McManus, is that this is just the latest example that in Texas government, the Texas government doesn't work for you. The Texas government works in the interest of itself and the wealthy. In this case, Ken Paxton has been used our public institutions to benefit himself and his friend Nate Paul while neglecting his duties to the people of Texas and the Texas Constitution. The Senate says that's not a problem. Not a problem at all. In fact, how dare anybody blow the whistle? How dare anybody investigate this guy who's wasting millions of dollars, not protecting the state, wasting money on lawsuits to defend himself and his criminality? Not a problem. This is the Texas Senate. Or to somebody like Greg Abbott, with no real opposition in the Texas GOP, no one strong enough to take him on, and certainly no one strong enough in the Democratic Party to take him on. Abbott has been ripping up the Texas Constitution when it came to COVID policy and to the border policy. Abbott is now turning our border into a war zone, terrorizing migrants and leading to the deaths of Texas National Guardsmen who are on the border as part of Operation Lone Star. All while an entire class of major Greg Abbott donors and GOP donors enrich themselves, fatten themselves up on our money on these dubious contracts, again, to brutalize people at the border. Clearly against the constitutional rules about the amount of power that a governor should have in this state. Clearly against the national constitution's rule about the ability of a governor to be able to operate border policy. No accountability there. No threat there. Do whatever you want. Not a problem. Or lastly, to the police in this state who stood by for an hour and 14 minutes, chatting on their phones, joking around as a lone gunman murdered 19 children and 2 teachers. No accountability to them. No accountability for the politicians responsible. In fact, anger and indignation from those people that anyone in this state says, that's not acceptable to us. There should be accountability for this kind of thing. All this talk about limited government, all this talk about the economic success of Texas, what is defining our era in Texas politics right now is that there is no accountability for the government. It works for the rich, the powerful, and the people in office, and it works to protect them. Well, folks, we're going to go over to Matt McManus, who's going to help us break down some of the ideologies that have got us into this mess. Matt put together a really incredible book that's out by Routledge. You can find the link below about right-wing thought, both internationally, the philosophical underpinnings of it, and in this country. It's a really great read. It was really incredible talking to him. We're going to talk a little bit about Nietzsche, Aristotle, and also some of the philosophical underpinnings of the right-wing movement.
Yeah, exactly. And I mentioned it in the interview, but it's a good. I've mentioned Corey Robbins' Reactionary Mind a lot. This is definitely one to put right next to that on the bookshelf. for folks who like to get a little bit more to dissect this stuff rather than just dunking on it. Yeah, here is Matt McManus. We'll be back for a little bit at the end. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, is David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother.
And joining us now is Matt McManus. Matt is a liberal democratic socialist, a lecturer at Poli-Sci University of Michigan, author of The Political Right and Equality, Turning Back the Tide of Egalitarian Modernity. He's been on Left Reckoning before to talk about, I believe, our boy James Lindsay.
That's right.
And his understanding of Marxism. But yeah, here we're talking about this book, Matt, The Political Right and Equality. And, let's just talk about the right, and you oppose them in this title against the something like equality. Why equality and not just credit them with being against or for things remaining the same?
Yeah, absolutely, right? So I want to say first off that it's great to be back. And I should say that a lot of the people I canvass in the book are, let's just say, a little smarter than James Lindsay. It's not really a very high bar to cross, but yeah, there we go, right? But the reason why I talk about equality in this book is, just like you said, there is this long-standing conception of the political right as being committed to conservatism, right? And this is genuinely a big facet of the political right and many of its instantiations, right? You can think about Bill Buckley's famous phrase that a conservative is just somebody who stands athwart history yelling stop, right? Or, the more mundane but kind of poetic claim that people on the political right just want to change what they need to in order to conserve what they can, right? But as I hope I demonstrate in the book, and I think as anybody can see now, there are many facets of the right that aren't really about conserving very much at all, right? They're very much committed to even radical transformations of the status quo. And I chronicle a lot of these in the book. So just to kind of step away from the text a little bit, let's look at American politics, right? 1964, Barry Goldwater comes onto the scene. He's kind of the shining star of conservatism after a long and painful rebirth after the FDR era. And Goldwater says extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, right? And he gets absolutely creamed for this. But flash forward 1980, it's not, the Democrats who are saying we need a new deal or a great society. It's Reagan who says we have it in our power to remake the world or to start the world again, right? Quoting the revolutionary Thomas Paine. Then you can go forward to the Bush administration. Famously, you had officials there saying, you people in the reality-based community, right, are so fixated on facts and the way that the world is. But we're an empire now, and we make our own reality, right? And all the rest of you will just be there to transcribe and record what it is that we do. Needless to say, get forward to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, certainly by January 6th, was not somebody who was sitting around thinking, I'm just going to be conserving institutions the way they are, because that's more or less what it is that, my political program is all about. He's committed to a radical upending of truly a decadent and problematic kind of liberal status quo, but nonetheless one that I think many progressives would prefer to whatever Trump wanted to replace the liberal status quo with, right? And these are all sides to the political right that we need to be attentive to. And when I say unifies all of them in the book, is this commitment to the idea that there are recognizably superior people in society or demonstrably superior people in society. And these people are just entitled to more, right? More political power, more status, more wealth, right? Very common one in the United States. And the way that different people on the political right understand this idea of recognizably or demonstrably superior people, that's really very different depending upon the situation. But that's the core commitment that animates all of them.
Yeah, and one of the things that's kind of interesting just on that, I think you make the point, and this is a more philosophic point, that the world isn't static; it's always becoming something. And I think that's a fundamental a way of seeing the world that can easily I think that's where we get nostalgia. I want the world to be like what I grew up as, and I thought that was a very interesting point in the book. That conservative, that's the sort of fundamental conceit of the right.
Absolutely, right? So there's no doubt that the right is often characterized or defined by a certain kind of nostalgia. And I talk a lot about that, especially in the early parts of the book, where I talk about its longstanding pining for what I call the Aristotelian universe, right? Not to be confused with what Aristotle himself actually argued for. But, one of the things that I also stress is that nostalgia obviously can become very future-oriented, and that's the paradox of it. So one of the things that you find in people like Joseph de Maistre or Dostoevsky, certainly Nietzsche, or, for that matter, Bill Buckley, Reagan, Trump, all the ones that I talk about, is they express a really deep dissatisfaction with things as they exist right now, because they say that the biggest problem with our society is that liberalism has been in the driver's seat for too long. Things were better back then, but of course we can't just go back to, when things were all good. So what ends up happening is the political right becomes very future-minded. And this is a point that Corey Robin also stresses in his book, The Reactionary Mind, very brilliantly, right? Where he says, the very odd thing about conservative nostalgia is that it almost invariably adopts the political right to adopt the future as its preferred tense, because the future will be a time when, of course, the left isn't in the driver's seat, the way that so many conservatives and so many on the right think that the left has been in the driver's seat for a long time. Which is always something that's a little consoling to me, because I'm like, boy, oh boy, do conservatives and the right think that leftists have a lot more power than we actually do.
Yeah. I mean, the Corey Robin book, I would recommend this to anybody who has read that Corey Robin book as basically a continuing study, because he mentions like that sense of conservative grievance for loss. I think maybe you write, or maybe you're quoting somebody that says like it's loss of something they were never entitled to in the first place, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. So I draw very heavily on a few different people, Robin and Wendy Brown. But one of the big parts of the book is where I talk a little bit about Nietzsche and this idea of ressentiment that he argues for. Now, when conservatives evoke this idea of ressentiment, it's always intended to characterize progressive movements as defined by ressentiment, right? And we'll get into that when we talk about Nietzsche. But what I point out is that there's a very distinctly reactionary or right-wing form of ressentiment, which is this idea that I am a recognizably superior person, and if things were going well, then society would recognize that and acknowledge that. And the only reason why I'm not recognized or acknowledged as a demonstrably superior person is the lower orders are trying to take that away from me, right? They're trying to take away something that I am entitled to and that I either once had, which is the lost bit, or that I should have, which is the futural dimension. And this is a very powerful animating impetus. And in some ways, it can be even more powerful than what we find on the left, because the left will usually sit there and say, all people are equal, or they should be treated as equal, and that's why we need to radically upend the status quo. Imagine how attractive it can be to tell a lot of people, many of whom feel dissatisfied and angry with the way things are going, that actually you're part of the master race, right? Or you're part of the supermen. And the only reason why you aren't treated like that is because these nasty leftists and liberals don't want to have a society where that kind of superiority will be acknowledged. Very infectious, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it just reminds me of, no, I'm just saying, like, on that, like, it reminds me of something that Bifo Berardi said at, like, the heyday of, like, Trumpism and these kind of far-right movements was that, like, the trick of fascism, if you want to call it that, he does. Is that, it replaces, you are not, like, to paraphrase him, he's like, you are not an exploited worker, you are actually a member of, like, a proud nation that is being held down. And that's why, the magic community of the state becomes very, very viable for the right, the nation, I mean, for the right to basically be able to speak to the future while they are, sort of ironically, talking about how things used to be in the past, or how we've gotten away from nature, or the way that things should be, but also be able to sort of occupy that future tense of politics that they do. In some ways better than the left can do, unfortunately, at least in the national discourse.
Absolutely, right. And I guess one of the core themes of the book is that we on the left should never underestimate either the intellectual or ideational power of right-wing ideology, right? Now, that's not to say that the right is correct. I don't think they're correct about mostly everything, right? I mean, left is best. But underestimating its appeal is a kind of luxury, something that we can't afford ourselves in an era of Trumpism. And I think what you said, Dave, about fascism is really an important point when we try to think through how it is that conservatism can make itself, or the right can make itself popular, right? Because if you go back to the 18th century, what you really see in the writings of people like Burke or de Maistre is a combination of disdain for the lower orders, right? You can think about Burke famously saying that the swinish multitude were trying to become the lords of the castle, and this was appalling, right? Or later on, where he talks about how it is that he would never put his faith in a society of barbers and bankers and bakers to be in control, because what do they know about running a state? And for a long time, the left has kind of internalized this sense of the right as just fundamentally anti-populist or anti-democratic. And there's still a lot of that comes through in right-wing discourse. Everybody's rushing over themselves to praise Mitt Romney right now, forgetting that back when he first ran for the highest office in the land, we called him Mr. 47%, right? And I'm sure that many people who are older like me will remember that joke. But what's important to note is that starting in the 19th century, the right really transitioned and it learned how to speak a kind of demotic language. And it did so in a way that is quite different from the left. Because where the left would usually put forward ideals of universal democracy, universal egalitarianism, the spread of equality and freedom and solidarity for all across the world, the right would typically say, listen, you, X group, who are a little further down the chain, you also belong to the higher order. And if you want to have your status affirmed, then obviously you need to side with us, because these progressives and these leftists will try to take that away from you, or they have taken it away from you, and we're going to help you get it back. Now, there are just a huge number of instantiations of this. I think Trumpism is a very modern one, but fascism is a very extreme iteration of it, right? So Roger Griffin describes fascism as a kind of palingenetic ultranationalism. And I offer a few criticisms of Griffin in the book, but I think that's largely right. And the characteristics of fascist palingenetic ultranationalism is to say, our nation is an elite that deserves to be at the apex of world civilization, the human species, you name it. You are also part of that nation, right? So you belong to this elite, and you will belong to this elite, except that the decadent forces of liberalism, socialism, and democracy internally and externally have denied our ultra nation its proper role in the world. So, of course, sign with us, the fascist party, and we'll bring you right up to the top. And there's a very populist dimension to this idea that the people have to participate in rejuvenating the ultra nation, except, of course, not through direct democracy or even participatory or representative democracy, but through obedience to the leader who reflects or represents or embodies even the so-called will of the ultranational people.
And I think what's so interesting about this book, and we don't have time to get into all the figures that you go into, but a frank discussion of the sort of the political elements, because I feel like when I was reading Aristotle for the first time, or Nietzsche, that stuff was sort of like impolite to talk about. I do remember, I don't want to get into each thing too much. I remember when I first got Netflix streaming, there was this documentary, Nietzsche and the Nazis, and it was much less like straightforward than I think the way you put. But one of the figures that you start with is Aristotle. And can you just explain to folks Aristotle's relationship to conservatism, or at least hierarchy?
Sure, absolutely, right. So this was one of the parts of the book that I had the most trouble with. I can't remember what author who said but the most difficult thing is to start. Probably Tolkien. I think Tolkien said the most difficult thing was to start. Since this was the initial part, I really struggled with it. And part of the reason I struggle with it is I want to be very clear. There are a huge number of leftists who have been influenced by Aristotle. Not least, my boy Karl Marx, right, who characterized Karl Marx as the greatest thinker of antiquity, right? Some people even characterize him as the Hegel of antiquity, and I think that's deserved. And there are a long list of contemporary leftists who are deeply inspired by Aristotelian thought, right? Martha Nussbaum, Amartya Sen, a lot of contemporary Marxists, traditionalists like Alistair McIntyre, who nonetheless have a lot of Marxist orientation. So just let's be clear about all that. The kind of Aristotle that I'm talking about is the Aristotle that puts forward this idea that I call the Aristotelian universe, that is a real nostalgia object for many conservatives. And to summarize it really briefly, the Aristotelian universe is defined by what Charles Taylor calls a social model of hierarchical complementarity. Okay, and what this basically means is just what those old charts about the feudal system seem to suggest, right? That society is a pyramid. There are people at the top and there are people at the bottom. It's hierarchical in that sense. It's complementary in the sense that just like a pyramid, the stones at the top need the stones at the bottom. Everyone has their kind of role to play, but it's by no means obvious. And in fact, it seems quite obvious that the inverse is true, that the people at the bottom have the same kind of dignity as those at the top. There's an inequity that exists. And Aristotle provides a huge amount of ideological justification for this outlook that people like Leo Strauss especially stress very emphatically. So there's this idea in Aristotle that, look, there are people who are more virtuous and more capable of rule by virtue of having a capacity for deliberative reason. Most of these belong to the upper orders, right? Because aristocrats are able to develop their aptitudes through education, warfare, being liberated from crude forms of labor. And Aristotle himself is a little cagey on whether or not you could have a democracy. He sometimes says yes, if you could elevate the people. But he's very clear about the fact that in any given society, there are some people who will not be allowed to participate in politics because they lack this capacity for deliberative reason. Women, for the most part, don't have it, right? Sometimes they do a little bit more, and he's willing to grant them a few more rights. But what he calls natural slaves evidently don't have deliberative reasons. So they're the ones who are going to be doing most of the manual labor to, in fact, liberate the upper echelons of Athenian or Greek society to pursue these kind of higher order projects like politics. And this idea, of course, is a model that many people will want to emulate in a wide variety of different ways, all the way down through Edmund Burke. And what starts to happen, I argue, in the 17th century, particularly in the writings of people like Hobbes, to a lesser extent Locke, is the inverse assertion. So where Aristotle posits this idea that there are natural unequals or evident unequals in society, and this natural inequality needs to map political inequality. In fact, Hobbes says, actually, in a state of nature, we're all equal, right? And he explicitly challenges Aristotle on this basis. And good materialist that Hobbes is, he says, look, I can tell you why it is that people are all equal in the state of nature, because for the most part, all human beings are homologously strong compared to one another. Some people might be a little stronger than others for a while, right? But even the weakest person can kill the strongest person quite easily, right? Just wait for them to go to sleep, right? Or two people can band together and take out, Dwayne Johnson. Maybe. Dwayne's pretty big, right? And, he says, some people might say, well, but that's not really what Aristotle was getting at. What he was getting at were intellectual variations. And Hobbes says, well, I actually tell you that the differences in cognitive abilities or intellectual talents between people is even less significant than physical differences, because compared to the expanse of what a person could know, even the wisest man knows extremely little, right? And not only that, he says, look, most people who flatter themselves that they're smarter than everyone else are doing just that. They're engaged in a kind of vainglorious exercise because, of course, we always regard our opinion as the right one. But get over yourself, because everyone feels that way, right? And there's this real deflationary materialist quality to this. And what Hobbes and these other figures are able to do is repivot political thinking to this position that, by definition or self-evidently, people are natural equals. And society should try to reflect that. And that, of course, upends this old Aristotelian way of looking at things and helps birth what I call egalitarian modernity in political thought.
And, that sort of answers my next question, which is, why was the Enlightenment such a formative time for conservative thought? I mean, how would you gauge conservatives' relationship to Enlightenment now? Like, I can't tell if there's sometimes they'll just outright, the Daily Wire has some guys who be like, yeah, it was bad entirely. And then other times they are the actual champions of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, that's a very complicated question, Matt. And a big part of the book actually takes up exactly these questions, because I argue that conservatives responded to the Enlightenment from initially a position of hostility, right? And you see this in the writings of people like Burke and de Maistre especially, right? Where Burke is extremely critical of the excesses of Enlightenment rationalism. This starts very early, I should say, including in his essay on the philosophical inquiry into the origins of the meaning of the sublime and the beautiful, where he says all these Enlightenment philosophers radically overestimate the importance of reason in human life. And he says we're actually much more motivated by aesthetic emotions, particularly our response to the sublime and beautiful, than we are to reason, qua reason. And you find the same kind of arguments iterated in Reflections on the Revolution in France, where Burke, and this is putting it really simply, will say, listen, this idea that people rationally deliberate upon the kind of political system that they want to have is nonsense, right? Most people don't have the capacity for rational deliberation, including the whole swinish multitude, right? But beyond that, the reason why most people defer to political authority is based upon tradition, yes, But this is where I differ from some other people. He also insists they also defer to authority because of what he calls the sublime qualities that are attached to superior kinds of figures or aristocratic kind of figures. I think this is really where Burke is extraordinarily novel in developing a unique political theory, because he's really the first one to say, where you put man over man, it's very important to attach these kind of sublime qualities to the person who's going to be erected over someone else. Because if you don't think that King Louis XIV is ordained by God to be in charge, or you don't think, to use Jordan Peterson's rhetoric, that there's some deep and mysterious law of nature that dictates that one lobster will rule over the other, then you might start to think that, well, this is just a silly guy in a dumb hat sitting on, an oversized chair. Why should I pay any attention to what he has to say? Why shouldn't I take charge of our political community, or why shouldn't we take charge of our political community? So Burke says we need to hold on to these sublime qualities because if we strip away what he also calls all the pleasing illusions that make subordination easy, then what we get is purely a society that needs to base itself on reason, anything that's only going to lead to chaos. And de Maistre is even more emphatic about this, where he says Enlightenment reason is fundamentally, and I quote, a destructive force. Why is it a destructive force? Because he says every pauper and every, baker will suddenly think that they have it in their power to think critically through how society will look. They're all going to reach different conclusions about that. And they're not entitled to those kinds of deliberations because it will corrode respect for authority. Instead, we need to treat authority, he says, like religious dogmas, right? Where it's a truth that you put your faith in and you appreciate its majesty from a position of distance. And he himself puts forward various arguments for why we should sublimate authority figures. He famously says, look, it seems evident to me that kings are almost always rarefied kind of figures that arrive in a moment of history that's really exciting and really essential, right? And ordained by God to be in charge. This is something we just need to accept as an absolute truth, right? So there's this insistence on myth and affect and aesthetics over Enlightenment reason as a basis for political society, or submission to dogma, right? Or sublimity, right? Now, I argue in the book that things begin to change in the 19th century because the reality is that leftists are really fucking good at deflating any attempt that conservatives make to attach sublime qualities onto authority figures. And this goes way back to people like Thomas Paine or Mary Wollstonecraft, where Wollstonecraft responding to Burke is like, what the fuck are you talking about, sublime qualities being attached to the aristocracy? This is just a man, right, who happened to wind up on the French throne because his ancestors killed an awful lot of people, right, waded in blood to reach the French throne. And she says, Burke is just attracted to what she calls Gothic notions of beauty, right, where he'll sit there and he'll watch ivy crawling up the wall of a building and say how delicate and how old and how sublime. But she says, if the ivy is choking out new growth, who wouldn't take a buzzsaw to it to allow the new to come to the fore? And Paine is even more insistent on this, where defending the French Revolution, he says, again, what is Burke talking about there, these sublime qualities that, are attached to the aristocracy? Most aristocrats are idiots, right? He compares them to peacocks who spend an awful lot of money wearing really fancy clothes, not really doing all that much, and really society would be better off without them, right? Taking the resources that they kind of drain away and committing it to things that are more useful. So the left is really good at attacking sublimity, right? Or sublime arguments for authority. I would add Marx to that list. But the different kind of arguments that conservatives will put forward based on Enlightenment reason, those are harder to reject. And starting in the 19th century, the right becomes quite good at appealing to a kind of pseudo-Enlightenment ideal in order to justify its preference for hierarchical forms of social order. Probably the most express of those, example of this, is all the defenses of capitalism that are put forward, maybe not including Adam Smith, but from like Malthus onward, right? A good example of this would be somebody like Ludwig von Mises, right? Particularly in his liberalism text, where von Mises says, look, if I look at nature, I disagree with Hobbes. I see that people are fundamentally unequal in terms of their aptitudes, in terms of their capabilities, in terms of what they're capable of contributing to society. And the market just reflects these natural inequities, right? Because some people can work harder, some people can work more intelligently, some people can build Tesla cars, and some people can, sweep floors, right? And the left, with its aspiration to kind of correct for that, they're actually the ones that are buying into this kind of theological notions of social justice and bringing about paradise on earth, whereas we here on the right are kind of staunch realists about what ordinary people are actually capable of doing and are committed to a kind of version of the Enlightenment project. Now, I also think that that's deeply mistaken, as a socialist and as a leftist, but we don't need to get into that because I've already talked a lot. Needless to say, it's a very common line of argumentation down to the contemporary era.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a much more difficult to counter than, I mean, the line from Thomas Paine in The Rights of Man, he pities the plumage but forgets the dying bird. Like,
yeah, great line.
He ethered him right there, back in the day. Let's move on to another figure that a lot of people, especially younger folks may be reading for the first time, Friedrich Nietzsche. And I remember reading Nietzsche, very digestible philosopher compared to some of the other people. I mean, Hegel, for instance.
Yeah.
I remember I had a Hegel and Nietzsche taught in the same class, and moving to Nietzsche from the Phenomenology of Spirit was like very nice. But why is it difficult why is it difficult for the left to embrace Nietzsche as a philosopher?
Well, look, I would actually say that for a long time, the left really tried to embrace Nietzsche as a philosopher, right? And, you don't need to look far for this. When I was doing my undergrad, the big thing was, reading people like Foucault or reading people like Deleuze or reading people like Derrida or Richard Rorty, all of whom say, Marx is too much of an Enlightenment thinker. He makes the odd good comment about ideology and liberal values and the problems with that. But really, we need to accept this kind of Nietzschean view that everything is a matter of perspective, right? And once you acknowledge that, we can kind of deconstruct the various ways that power tries to insist on its universality when actually it's just a partial kind of view, a kind of imposition upon people. And look, I'm not knocking the products of these attempts to turn Nietzsche into a leftist. I learned a lot from Coe. I learned a lot from Deleuze. I really like people like Richard Rorty in some respects. And whenever I say mean things about Nietzsche, this is partly me covering my ass, right? I'll inevitably get a long series of emails from people being like, how dare you try to, cancel Nietzsche, or, he's a great thinker and who are you to do this? Not what I'm trying to do at all, right? But what I'm trying to insist, in line with actually a lot of really great Marxist thinkers, going back to Lukács, is that by all means try to play with Nietzschean ideas, but recognize that what you're doing is playing with Nietzschean ideas in a way that he would not be happy with. Because if you go back and you look at Nietzsche's own thought, he is definitely not a leftist, not even a liberal, right? Except maybe kind of in an aristocratic sense in his middle period. But by the time you get to his mature period, he's really committed to a philosophy of aristocratic radicalism. Or as he once put it somewhere else, I think it was in The Will to Power, he said, I am not an individualist, even though people insist that I am. My philosophy is committed to rank ordering. And what this means, what aristocratic radicalism connotes, is something that he shouts from the rooftop in pretty much every book from Thus Spoke Zarathustra going forward. He insists that contemporary liberalism, socialism, and democracy are all the kind of bastardized secular offsprings of Christianity. Really provocative thesis, if you think about it, since Jordan Peterson would probably be shocked to hear that all the trans activists are really the contemporary Christians, whereas he's on the side of, anti-Christian reaction, right? But all that, all joking aside, right? He says, look, these kinds of philosophies are life dampening. They emerge from the ressentiment of the herd, just like Christianity did. And so consequently, what we need to do is reject them, right? Because they lead to nihilism and the degradation of culture. Because if you put the herd in charge of political institutions and social institutions, it's going to produce a herd-like culture that's really satisfactory only to cows, right? And in Beyond Good and Evil, he says, my ideal is very much an aristocratic culture, right? Where the truly superior specimens rule over the herd, as is natural, and even dominate and completely enslave the herd. He's not very shy at all in talking about the need for a slave class to serve at the discretion of the new kind of aristocracy that he calls from. And sometimes this gets extremely vicious, right? So one of the points that I make in the book that's a little cheeky, but it's kind of funny, is he decides to take a broadside at Otto von Bismarck, right? Well-known socialist justice warrior, Otto von Bismarck, helped crush the Chaos Commune, saying, you are being way too soft on the workers and way too sympathetic with socialism because you are educating the workers and you are preparing them for a minimal amount of political involvement by being allowed to vote in the sham elections in the Second German Empire, right? The German Empire. And he says, you shouldn't be doing that, right? What we want is a slave caste, right? And if we want a slave caste, don't educate the people, train them to be slaves. If you train them to be citizens, then you shouldn't be surprised when all of a sudden they become attracted to things like socialism and liberalism and decide that they deserve a bigger share of the social pie. Really remarkable stuff when you think that Otto von fucking Bismarck is too left-wing, too woke for Nietzsche, right?
Yeah. Then the quote here is one of the all-timers. The worker has been made liable for military service, and he has been allowed to form unions and to vote. No wonder the worker already feels his existence to be a state of distress, expressed in moral terms as a state of injustice. But what does one want? To ask it again, if one ills an end, one must also will the means to it. If one wants slaves, one is a fool if one educates them to be masters. I mean, it's pithy in the classic Nietzschean sense, but that is a very elitist expression of opinion there.
Absolutely. And I mean, in the Antichrist, he's also not clear. He's also very clear about who his real enemy is, right? Politically, at the very least. Now, I don't know if I go as far as Lukács in saying that ultimately you can interpret every facet of Nietzsche's thought as a kind of response to socialism. I think that that's undervaluing the originality of Nietzsche's thoughts on metaphysics, epistemology, ontology, you name it, right? But he is very clear that he hates socialists the most, right? In the Antichrist, he says, who do I hate the most, right? That rabble of Chandler, the anarchists, the socialists, they all have the Christian as their shared ancestor, and they all deserve to, be thrown into the ash heap of history, right? Very, very express about the fact that he is just militantly opposed to anything like socialism, including democracy and liberalism, which he sees as kind of way stations on the way to socialist revolution, right? Now, apparently, he actually had started to read Marx. In one of his notebooks, he underlined the name Marx and wrote a few drafts saying, must read, must do those things. So as a enemy of Nietzsche's, who's nonetheless interested in his work, I'm deeply kind of sad that we never got that book, because it would have been, boy, would that have been an interesting book to read, Nietzsche on Marx or something. We never got that. So nowhere do we find a kind of systematic deconstruction of socialism, but it can definitely be reconstructed from all his work. And the point is always emphasized that socialism needs to go and be replaced with aristocratic radicalism.
So looking at this group of thinkers, right? And you go in great depth in your book about this. But how can we get these kind of thinkers and the ground that they sort of lay to today? Because one thing that's really interesting about, like, for example, like the American, like, intellectual right, let's just drop the politicians for a second.
Sure.
Is they have to do this, funny move, right? Where there is like this, love for Aristotle, for like antiquity. Some folks, folks like Nietzsche or Burke, right? But they also have to find a way to sort of root it in like the American story and context, right? Into these ideas like democracy, into these fights against the aristocracy, and certainly like the rights of kings and princes. So, how does this transition sort of happen in the American context to sort of, keep the stuff in Aristotle that you want, but also sort of say, like, I'm also a son of the American Revolution too, right?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I devote a lot of the middle sections of the book to talking about American conservatism, not least because I teach at an American university and, growing up in Canada, all of us, watch American TV and rot out our brains, with all that, 24/7. But I also think America is a very interesting country for anybody who wants to study the right, because in the ancien regimes of Europe, there were aristocratic societies that were long-standing, that were regarded as traditional. And the conservative movements that emerged, or the right-wing movements that emerged in those countries, invariably tended to perceive liberalism as a threat, the first threat before socialism, right? And this continues all the way through the fascist movements, for example, where many fascists conflate liberalism, socialism, and democracy together because they all see them as emerging from the same kind of Enlightenment basis, right? Things are different, though, in the United States, which from the beginning was at least nominally a liberal state. Now, of course, we're talking about a racial liberal state, right? One that definitely didn't really mean it when Jefferson said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, but I'm my slaves, right? But at least nominally, there was this commitment to liberty for all and freedom for all, however imperfect. And of course, we know that much of the politics of the early United States and the contemporary United States centers around the best way to understand this idea of being committed to liberty for all and equality for all. So the kind of conservatism that emerges here deals and internalizes these principles and finds new ways to instantiate them. Now, the story of American conservatism is way too long to get into in great depth here. But, just abbreviated, right? What you found in the 19th century was a combination in the South of respect for racial inequality, right? Or even a staunch defense of racial inequality. And in the North, a kind of not necessarily conservative, but certainly right-wing liberal support for the inequities that emerge in market society. And after the Civil War, a lot of this gets married together through a kind of social Darwinian ethos that pervades thinking on issues of race and also thinking about issues of how the market reflects various different kinds of natural inequalities. And this combination, of course, still remains a very infectious one for many on the political right. If you think about somebody like Richard Hanania, right, who defines himself as a classical liberal, but is certainly very comfortable with extraordinary degrees of inequality in the market, and also think that those map racial inequalities, since, certain groups are not able to compete as effectively in a pure market society. Now, this allows the political right to more or less chug along pretty successfully in America for a long period of time, up until about the 1930s, when the Great Depression happens. And what occurs then is you really see a realignment in the way that the country thinks of itself under the auspices of things like FDR and the New Deal. Now, we all know that the New Deal was very imperfectly applied, and that the Democrats at the time, partly because of their deep association with the South, still denied many of the benefits of the New Deal to racialized minorities. FDR apparently, according to Cass Dusting, was deeply unhappy with that and actually wanted to kind of wean the Democratic Party away from its own racist heritage over time. Was only partially successful at that. But what gradually starts to happen by the time you get to the 1950s is a shift in the Overton window, where a kind of liberalism, progressive liberalism, is ascendant in the United States and is committed to kind of two prongs. The first is a commitment to New Deal style liberalism, however imperfect and however not socialist enough, and of course a commitment to racial equality, as witnessed in the kind of burgeoning civil rights movement and some of the decisions being issued by the Supreme Court about racial integration in the South. And it's out of this atmosphere in the 1950s that the modern conservative movement in the United States emerges, and it really emerges, at least at the start, from an atmosphere of defeat, right? Where if you read something like Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, one of the things that's really transparent about it is he says in the opening of his book that conservatism, or the political right, is the philosophy of the losers, right? In the almost literal sense that conservatives have fought a battle against the burgeoning tide of egalitarian modernity since, at the very least, the French Revolution and American Revolution, and they've lost almost every single battle they fought against that. And he's determined to put a stop to this. And you also see it in Bill Buckley's kind of attitude, right? Where Buckley sometimes liked to characterize the early American conservative movement that he's trying to form, or this new American conservative movement that he's trying to form, as a kind of dissident movement, right? Almost pseudo-punk in its orientation, even though Buckley came from just enormous wealth and privilege, right? Wealth and privilege that, very few of us can frankly fucking imagine, right? But, you see this in a lot of his early books, especially, God and Man at Yale, where he talks about being a young student encountering leftists and progressives and Keynesians everywhere and not particularly liking it. And these intellectuals band together. They found a variety of magazines and think tanks, many of which are still in operation if you think about, the National Review. And they start laying the intellectual groundwork for a new kind of conservative synthesis. And eventually this emerges, this consolidates around what's sometimes called the three-legged stool, where the new conservative movement is going to be a fusion, it's usually the term, of social conservatives, particularly from the American South, but not exclusively, who have, let's put it this way, not a few revanchist views on racial issues, but other conservatives kind of tell them to keep them quiet or, things will get worse. The next leg of the stool is, of course, free market libertarians. And then the third leg of the stool ultimately become neocons, who emerge out of anti-communist movements, and then eventually, of course, become the main proponents of things like the War on Terror, which we all know ended just triumphantly, right? It was a great movement. And this three-legged stool is a pretty solid base intellectually and politically for conservatives to build upon. Now, I mentioned early on that its first kind of trial run with the Barry Goldwater campaign in 1964 is really not successful at all. There are a lot of reasons why. Rick Perlstein chronicles them just beautifully in his book on Barry Goldwater. People get a chance to read it. But the country just wasn't really ready for conservatism at that point. FDR's memory was still fresh for a lot of people. Kennedy had just been assassinated. Johnson was a very popular politician in 1964, and his great vision of a great society centered around New Deal liberalism and a commitment to racial equality is what ultimately wins out and finally accomplishes this pivot FDR wanted in turning the Democrats into a small L liberal party that's kind of moderately progressive. Not enough for my taste, but moderately progressive. But then, 1968, Richard Nixon wins the election, right? By a hair. And it's because he's committed to this idea that too much liberal progressivism has taken the country in a wrong direction. It's taken it into Vietnam, and it's also led to chaos and riots in the street, right? If you think about the May 68 uprisings. And he promises that, his moral majority commitment to law and order will kind of take the country back from the brink. And doesn't win too much, but his first administration is really important because he's able to appoint a number of Supreme Court justices to switch the court pretty much permanently, if you think about it, in a conservative direction. Then 1972, he wins big, right? Now, we all know he doesn't stay in office that long because of Watergate, but it's really clear at this point that the tide has turned. And by the time we get to Ronald Reagan, we enter into really a conservative era where they've been in the driver's seat for more or less 20 years, I'd say, so substantially that people like Bill Clinton, who are elected, as Democrats, right, really start to talk the language of the Republican Party, try to outdo the Republican Party on things like being tough on crime or gutting welfare. And this is really very significant in indicating how the overtime window in American politics has just shifted sharply right. And not just in America, I should say, either. Margaret Thatcher once famously said that her biggest accomplishment, and I'm sure many of your listeners have heard of this, was Tony Blair, right? Because Tony Blair enacted a very similar kind of transition in British politics, dropping a commitment to socialism, moving towards Blairism or third wayism with all of its charms, and eventually, getting into the war in Iraq and discrediting himself. And, if there's any justice, he would be in The Hague, rotting away in a jail cell somewhere. That's neither here nor there. That's just a little bit of residual bitterness on my part, right? But, this conservative era that we now live in the United States and in the Anglosphere has been with us for a very long time. And there's a lot more that I can say about the story, but that's more or less my, nutshell kind of summation of it, I think.
I also want to get you to trace your observations on the relationship with Christianity, and we've kind of touched on it a little bit. Like Nietzsche, obviously, very not Christian thinker, but I can't. I'm fascinated by T.S. Eliot's another version. I remember as an English major reading The Wasteland and all of this stuff, and kind of knowing that there's a politics thing to that. And the guy's Ezra Pound, there's a politics story there. We're not going to maybe get into that. We're just going to deal with one poem and maybe hint at some of the political allegiances of some of these guys or whatever. But a very conservative, but I did know that Eliot's a very conservative guy and a Christian, but his relationship with Christianity is a little bit different than I think. It reminds me of Falwell, just very cynical. This is for you, y'all, to stay in line so I can keep doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, absolutely, right. The subject of Christianity comes up again at several points of the book. When I look at people like Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, or T.S. Eliot, And there's a lot more to say about the subject matter of the relationship of Christianity and the political right and the political left than is covered in the book, right? But I think I'll just rely on a pretty simple bifurcation here, right? So for most leftists, right, their understanding of Christianity is really shaped by the experience of the French Revolution, right, where Christianity was seen as the kind of handmaiden of reaction, with a lot of justification, right? And part of the reason for this is over a long period of time, a Catholic kind of Christianity really became aligned with support for this Aristotelian view of society as defined by a hierarchically complementary model, right? And you see expressions of this in the writings of people like St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and most church doctrine right up until the 18th and 19th century. And of course, when the French Revolution happens, many revolutionaries, their main target is throne and altar kind of conservatism, right? They're going to, what is it again? Hang the last aristocrat with the entrails of the last priest, right? That's the kind of jargon that goes around. And the Catholic Church gets a very well-deserved reputation from this point onward as providing a sustained ideological set of justifications against liberalism, against socialism, against democracy. It goes right up until the mid-20th century, right? And those forms of conservatism and Christianity, conservative Christianity, are still very much with us. Anybody who looks at the Christian right or Christian nationalist right knows that full well, right? But there's another kind of Christianity that people like Nietzsche are worried about, which is egalitarian and is emancipatory, right? Now, part of this can be seen in the various liberal movements that emerged, certainly from the 17th century onward. For instance, Karl Polanyi points out that probably the first socialists were the levelers that emerged in the midst of the English Civil War, with their demands for a high degree of economic equality and political participation, except giving this a Christian justification. And what defined the levelers, of course, was they were far more radical than even the kind of liberal reformers that were advocating a transition to parliamentary democracy. Hence Polanyi's claim that here we see the birth of radicalism. But then going forward through the 19th century, you see the emergence of things like Christian socialism, both in Europe and the United States. And in the middle of the 20th century, I think it's really telling that if you look at the United States, by far the most successful political movement that has emerged, that is committed to radical social change in America, was, of course, the Civil Rights Movement, which had a very pronounced Christian base. And anybody who studied MLK closely will know also a very clear socialist kind of base to it. Gary Dorian has chronicled this very nicely. People get to read his really epic history of American democratic socialism, right? And these facets of Christianity are what people like Nietzsche are really going to resist. The kind of Christianity that insists the wretched of the earth are God's chosen people, and they will know that God is on their side. And Nietzsche will argue that ultimately this Christian slave morality and its insistence that all people should be equal is what mutates and evolves over time in many different instantiations into liberalism first, but then into a commitment for universal democracy and socialism. And he's extremely expressive about this, not just in The Antichrist, where he talks about the anarchist and the socialist and Christian and how they have the same ancestor, but even in The Will to Power, when he says that socialism can be defined as Christianity with what he calls the residue of Rousseau, which is a really nice, pithy kind of statement. And I think that there's something to this thesis, right? I think that there are definitely radical forms of Christianity out there that the left should align with. Certainly that I do. And I don't think that we should see the ground of religious faith or spirituality, whether in Christianity or Islam or Judaism or anything else, to the political right, because that's a big win for them that I don't think they frankly deserve. And one of the reasons that I talk a lot about Tolstoy in the book, particularly in response to people like Dostoevsky, is I think Tolstoy really offers a kind of radical figure and radical literature that we can use to demonstrate not just the kind of literary powers of somebody who's on the left, but the depth of the left's spirituality, right? Their soul, if you want. Because there is nobody who demonstrated a deeper compassion for the poor and a deeper contempt for aristocratic society and the violence entailed with it than Tolstoy. But of course, you combine this with a truly epic kind of inner greatness that I really hope to see a lot of leftists emulate wherever it is that they can. Particularly, this comes through in books like The Kingdom of God is Within You or his Confession book.
I mean, and we'll probably talk earlier in the show. Sean Fain was busting out the Book of Matthew today, and well, speaking of the different book of A. Matthew, the political right and equality, turning back the tide of egalitarian modernity. Matt McManus at Matt Polprof on Twitter.
That's me. People can also email me if they want. MattMcManus300@gmail.com. It's pretty simple, right? Just keep it short. Sometimes people send me these long fucking, paragraph emails, and I appreciate that. I really do. But I got so many student emails, I can never read them. So, 2 paragraphs if you can.
Yeah, kill your darlings if you're emailing the professor. Thanks so much, Matt. Great book. And we'll talk to you soon for another one of your projects.
Yeah, take care, boss. Thanks.
Keep those emails short, friends.
you gotta, that's the thing is I haven't used an AI for any sort of grammar, like Grammarly. I mean, everything gets called AI now, even things that existed before. But shortening, editing, because I edited this newspaper in college, just takes shit out, man. You gotta and get to the point. Actually, one other thing is listening to particularly the JFK and LBJ tapes when they be talking with military guys. Military people get to the fucking point. There's just one thing about a chain of command or whatever when you're reporting things, and I assume it's true about any military, but you don't faff around with preamble and that sort of stuff, because somebody will tell you, hey, my time is valuable. But yeah, speaking of that, we mentioned that Sean Fain thing, and I know you talked about this on Thursday, but it is interesting because you got a similar reaction that our boys at the Valley Labor Report got, which is that this is easy on religion. And it's guys, he is leading a giant union, right? And also I mean, I don't know, there's different requirements to commenting on YouTube to leading a union, and I think also being able to speak in a register that spans from the Bible to Malcolm X, I think that's good. But anyway, let me play this clip because he's also saying what's also nice about this, and I'll let this come, is he's saying the working class, which is just another reason it's nice to have labor unions at the head of discourse, because I'm sick of hearing about the middle class. Here he is.
We will move this mountain. The idea that an everyday auto worker can take on the loftiest billionaire, that if we work hard and we work together, we can move these mountains. So I have to ask all of you, do you have faith? Are you ready to stand up together and move that mountain? Nobody's coming to save us. Nobody can win this fight for us. Our greatest hope and our only hope is with each other, standing together. And I'll tell you this, I'm at peace with the decision to strike if we have to, because...
And you got into it. He continues and he goes into what is heaven or described as, and then what is hell, and how there's a conscious decision to put people through hell on earth so that these people can move giant digits around different databases into other databases so people can speculate on which other companies they want to pull money from. It's really sick where we're at right now.
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean the entire clip is definitely worth watching. The live streams in general are usually really informative. But I mean, I think the framing is great here, right? Because you're saying, not only is this hell, but it's a man-made hell, right? It's not a reaction of, it's not like those kind of televangelists would be like, oh, this hurricane hit because we're too gay, right? Or something like that. He's saying this is something that is created by human beings, this hell on earth. This is something that we have to be prepared to fight against. I think being able to be well versed in that kind of language is very, I mean, it speaks to people. It's very powerful. being able to speak truly about, not just the the fact that the wages aren't fair, but the fact that this is an attack on your life, right? He talks about parts of the hell on earth that he sort of breaks down are not having any time to spend with your family or your community. That's hell, right? You become, to use Marxist terms, right, you become an appendage of the machine, right? You lose your humanity. Your humanity is degraded. And being able to fight for that, to reclaim, our dignity and our power. Man, somebody saying stuff like that, going on strike, that's a damn good thing. And I don't know, you'd have to get me pretty hard pressed to have anything to complain about that.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just say like this does feel like such a big moment in terms of paying attention to political things, like, and there's kind of an uneasy uneasy feeling of like I hope they just crush. I hope they crumble. I hope because yeah, I mean it's just like this very significant
Mhm.
time, and yeah, and to see people smarter than me and following labor be excited about the strategy of the stand-up strike, and also just to hear the very transparent way Fane on those live streams talks through like, okay, I understand there's a lot of members who would like to just strike everywhere at once, and part of me
Mhm.
would like to do that too, but we're doing it this way, and this is a product of our these groups, and it's just like it's an inspiring display of democracy. And so I mean,
And
yeah,
and
it's
and power, and let's be clear about that. So, like,
yeah,
talking a little bit about the strike, so for people, who might not have been following, and you should please do, they didn't call for like a full-on walkout. Instead, they're doing what they're calling the stand-up strike. And okay, I'll tell the story in a second, but let me just set something up. Why is there even a debate? I think some people know what we're talking about, some people don't, right? Some people are worried that basically the UAW is going to back down. And this new tactic is them sort of retreating from maybe more militant options. Why do we want workers to go on strike? What is the reasoning here? Well, it's because that is the most powerful weapon that working people have, right? Not just in the sense of like getting the results that we want, but also expressing power, making those people at the top hurt. You're pulling money out of their pocket when you're not working, right? So you want to wage that kind of economic warfare against them. Absolutely. Now, when they announced the strategy called the stand up strike, which is instead of having everybody walk out, all the plants shut down, instead, what they were going to do was to have tactical strikes, tactical walkouts. So certain facilities would be targeted, and then people will go on strike at those facilities while the other places will still be continuing operation. The reason this is a very exciting strategy and unique strategy is one, it allows the UAW to ramp things up as needed, which gives you a lot of bargaining power and a lot of leverage. So what will typically happen is if you go on strike, you think you're meeting the next day with the company, you think the company is going to hold a meeting and you're going to continue negotiations, Matt? No. Everyone walks away and it's, you're gone for days, not weeks, for being able to push for this contract. Which again is like that's the the goal here, right? Is to get a good contract for these workers. This allows them to ramp it up. And Sean Fain's already been doing that this week. He made an announcement earlier this week. Hey, we started going on strike last week. We're still waiting. TikTok. He tweeted out a video of Samuel Jackson.
is that him?
Movie.
If it is, it's a brand new Twitter account with
Okay, so maybe someone else did it. The UAW retweeted it, so maybe it's somebody being him. I don't know.
it looks official, but it only has like 6,000 followers, so I haven't retweeted it yet. But it looks like it's very funny first tweet if that is his
Hmm.
first one, and also respect for not becoming a verified Twitter user.
Well, anyways, there's there's all of this, but he said earlier this week in a video that he put out, hey, we're waiting, we're here, we're ready. What's going
Right.
on with these companies? Hey, if we do not get movement on this, we're going to call out for more strikes on Friday. He's already using the threat, right? So any of these people who are like, oh, this is them backing down, this is them being conservative, this is them being weak, it's just been proven wrong. In my
Yeah.
opinion. Now, I'm not
Right.
saying the strategy is above criticism or all of those things are coming from ignorance or bad faith or anything like that. But there is a kind of armchair leftist socialist out there who, if they don't see something express itself in the way that they're expecting, that means that people are being conservative. And as I said last Thursday during the show, one thing you have to understand within this strike and why it's so important for all of us to support it, is that there's an uphill battle because this Sean Fain slate that is empowering the UAW won by what, 500 votes, right? And yes, they got 97% strike authorization from the union. But there's no doubt about it that there were probably some people in leadership positions in some parts of the country who aren't all gung ho on this, right? So what does this do? This allows, instead of having a nasty conversation or like what a local doesn't join you when you call a strike last week, for example, right? That becomes a big public debate and that hurts you as a union. What does this do? This allows all these incredible stories that we've seen from the past few days to get the membership excited, to get them ready to be militant, to be ready to fight against the companies, to be able to express their power and to win these gains. And you get that from utilizing this kind of strategy. So it's like sometimes people from the outside, they don't really think about what the conditions might be. And these stories, I mean, I know people have probably heard it, but people should read Daniel Boguslaw. Apologies, Daniel, if I'm saying your name wrong. In the Intercept says, confused automakers brace for strike at the wrong plants. And people should read the pieces in the Intercept now. It's really good. But this is something that was being reported early on, is that certain facilities were expecting to be struck. So what the companies did is they rerouted production to move things around. And then those facilities stayed open and other ones closed. So what does that do?
Yeah.
That creates chaos throughout the operation and losses for these companies.
Yeah, so I mean, it really feels like planting false intelligence in war. Like we're gonna move our cavalry through here, and actually no, it's through there. But CNBC reported, citing a source familiar with UAW strategy, a list of plants. They said the UAW plan to strike. I mean, misinformation through CNBC. That is beautiful. Big Three moved a bunch of engines around and shut down various plants to anticipate it. They were wrong on every count and at great expense moved engines from plants that didn't strike to plants that did strike. Total failed by the executives, which allowed the UAW to paralyze their operations while sending most of their members to work conserving the strike fund. That is beautiful. Yeah, that's great.
No, I mean, these are battle tactics, right? Like this is somebody in a struggle against capital. This is a union in a struggle against these big companies. It's incredible. It's really militant. It should have nothing but your full support right now. And yeah, the way that these things are being framed is not just wages. And I know sometimes I might harp on this, but this is a fundamental point about some of the conservatism that we've seen even within the union movement in this country. Like so much of the conversation is almost exclusively on wages, right? Because when you start asking for better working conditions, they're like, oh, we can't do anything about that, right? We need to be in control. Remember last week we played the rich guy in Australia who was complaining about how people were refusing to do certain tasks and things like that. They want to have that whip, right? And they never want to give that up. They'll sometimes give some wage increases, not what everyone's asking for, but some, right? What really scares them is when you say, hey, I want a shorter work week. I want more authority over my life and my job site. And those are the kind of demands that are in this UAW fight, which is a massive shift in labor. So these are things that we should certainly be supporting.
That reminds me that our end on our call to action, which is we'll get a few thousand on the replay and podcast for this, and then there's 175 people watching live now. Go to your local news and share some UAW propaganda onto their stories covering this, and flood the zone. There's gonna be a lot of bots, a lot of crypto guys being morons. Go there and like your local news will probably have some story about it. Probably only have a few comments, well, I mean, I'm from North Dakota, so mine only has a few comments, but whatever it is, get in there.
And be confident too. 75% of Americans support the UAW workers on strike. This is a winning issue, by the way, and politicians should be supporting these folks and not running away.
Biden needs to, I mean, it's unbelievable. This whole, Obama said some history. FDR famously said, if I can't remember what kind of worker, but I would join a union. That was a big thing in presidential politics. Obama famously said, if your rights are under attack for collective bargaining, I'll put on my comfortable shoes and get on the picket line with you. And he didn't. And so Joe here has a very easy look. They say it's like unprecedented. Who the fuck cares? That's like it's the right thing to do, man. It's the
It's
right thing
easy.
to do, and like I don't think Trump is going to be able to follow through because I think his instincts are towards suppressing labor.
No, but
But
what
I
Trump
think,
can do is he's going to show up, and that's
yeah.
like half of the battle for Trump, just like it was in East Palestine, right?
And Biden, I think it would make a difference. I mean, I don't know, but like it can't hurt if Joe Biden gets out there and says like, "Hey, fair contract," or whatever slogan
Hmm.
he's saying, and appreciate Bernie being out there. We should note that Fain has said about Trump, like we're trying to rid ourselves of an economy that works for creates billionaires like Trump, whatever. Joe Biden, there's no excuse. This is a defining moment, absolutely, for his administration, for his first term. And if he wants to be the better than Obama president, he needs to do this. It's a very clear contrast. Are you going to actually show up for unions and not just like, 6 months later, we like got them on the back end with a little
Hmm.
bit of something? No, when it matters, are you going to show up, or are you going to be like, well, I don't want to offend the fucking Chris Farley's brother and
Yeah.
Henry Ford's like fourth grandkid? Like, come on, man, show up
Hmm.
if you're gonna talk about it.
Well, folks, we're going to go over to the postgame patreon.com/leftreckoning where we got some more clips and things to get to. We'll also be taking some questions from the audience. All the support really helps us out continue to cover these things and support these movements. So please consider joining up, just $5 a month, patreon.com/leftreckoning. We got some fun things coming up in the next couple weeks too. So you're going to want to keep tuned in to this channel and keep spreading the word, friends.
Yeah, tonight on the post game, I'm going to. Well, I went into some vintage Tucker Carlson. I was just curious what he was saying during the financial crisis. Surprised it was libertarian. And also, I kind of want to get into a little bit of the door stuff, but not in a video clipping way. So we'll just talk about some of the stuff that came out on the Vanguard Boys podcast last week. And I've already talked too much about Russell Brand, so we will not be talking about that. My disappointment there. But anyway, patreon.com/left reckoning to join David and I in about probably 15 minutes.
All right. See y'all soon.